Saint-Domingue was a French colony on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola from 1659 to 1804. The French had established themselves on the western portion of the islands of Hispaniola and Tortuga by 1659. In the Treaty of Ryswick of 1697, Spain formally recognized French control of Tortuga Island and the western third of the island of Hispaniola. In 1791, the slaves and some free people of color of Saint-Domingue began waging a rebellion against French authority. The rebels became reconciled to French rule following the abolition of slavery in the colony in 1793. Although this alienated the island's dominant slaveholding class, France controlled the entirety of Hispaniola from 1795 to 1802, when a renewed rebellion began. The last French troops withdrew from the western portion of the island in late 1803, and in 1804 this territory declared its independence as the Republic of Haiti. Overview: Spain controlled the entire island of Hispaniola from the 1490s until the 17th century, when French pirates began establishing bases on the western side of the island. The official name was La Española, meaning the Spanish. It was also called Santo Domingo or San Domingo. Beginning in the 1630s, the Antilles were divided among the colonial powers. Spain received Hispaniola and named their colony Santo Domingo, after Saint Dominic. The western part of Hispaniola was neglected by the Spanish authorities, however, and French buccaneers settled there, first on the Tortuga Island, then on La Grande Terre. Spain later ceded the entire western portion of the island to France. The French called their portion of Hispaniola Saint-Domingue, the French equivalent of Santo Domingo. The Spanish colony on Hispaniola remained separate, and eventually became the Dominican Republic, the capital of which is still named Santo Domingo. Establishment: when Christopher Columbus took possession of the island in 1492, he named it Insula Hispana, meaning the Spanish island, in Latin. As Spain conquered new regions on the mainland of the Americas, its interest in Hispaniola waned, and the colony's population grew slowly. By the early 17th century, the island and its smaller neighbors, notably Tortuga, became regular stopping points for Caribbean pirates. In 1606, the King of Spain ordered all inhabitants of Hispaniola to move close to Santo Domingo, to avoid interaction with pirates, rather than secure the island. However, this resulted in French, English and Dutch pirates establishing bases on the now abandoned north and west coasts of the island. French buccaneers established a settlement on the island of Tortuga in 1625 before going to Grande Terre. At first they survived by pirating Spanish ships, eating wild cattle and hogs, and selling hides to traders of all nations. Although the Spanish destroyed the buccaneers' settlements several times, on each occasion they returned due to an abundance of natural resources. Hardwood trees, wild hogs and cattle, and fresh water. The settlement on Tortuga was officially established in 1659 under the commission of King Louis XIV. In 1665, French colonization of the islands Hispaniola and Tortuga entailed slavery-based plantation agricultural activity such as growing coffee and cattle farming. It was officially recognized by King Louis XIV. Spain tacitly recognized the French presence in the western third of the island in the 1697 Treaty of Ryswick. The Spanish deliberately omitted direct reference to the island from the treaty, but they were never able to reclaim this territory from the French. The economy of Saint-Domingue became focused on slave-based agricultural plantations. Saint-Domingue's black population quickly increased. They followed the example of neighboring Caribbean colonies in coercive treatment of the slaves. More cattle, and slave agricultural holdings, coffee plantations and spice plantations were implemented, as well as fishing, cultivation of cocoa, coconuts and snuff. Saint-Domingue quickly came to overshadow the previous colony in both wealth and population. Nicknamed the Pearl of the Antilles, Saint-Domingue became the richest and most prosperous French colony in the West Indies, cementing its status as an important port in the Americas for goods and products flowing to and from France and Europe. Thus, the income and the taxes from slave-based sugar production became a major source of the French budget. Among the first buccaneers was Bertrand de Guerin, who played a big part in the settlement of Saint-Domingue. He encouraged the planting of tobacco, which turned a population of buccaneers and freebooters, who had not acquiesced to royal authority until 1660, into a sedentary population. De Guerin also attracted many colonists from Martinique and Guadeloupe, including John Roy, Jean Hebert and his family, and Guillaume Barre and his family, who were driven out by the land pressure which was generated by the extension of the sugar plantations in those colonies. But in 1670, shortly after Cap Français had been established, the crisis of tobacco intervened and a great number of places were abandoned. The rows of freebooting grew bigger. Plundering raids, like those of Veracruz in 1683 or of Capture in 1686, became increasingly numerous, and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Senlis, elder son of Jean-Baptiste Colbert and at the time Minister of the Navy, brought back some order by taking a great number of measures, including the creation of plantations of indigo and of cane sugar. The first sugar windmill was built in 1685. On the 22nd of July 1795, Spain ceded to France the remaining Spanish part of the island of Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, in the Second Treaty of Basel, ending the War of the Pyrenees. The people of the eastern part of Saint-Domingue were opposed to the arrangements and hostile toward the French. The islanders revolted against their new masters and a state of anarchy ensued, leading to more French troops being brought in. An early death among Europeans was very common due to diseases and conflicts. The French soldiers that Napoleon sent in 1802 to quell the revolt in Saint-Domingue were attacked by yellow fever during the Haitian Revolution, and more than half of the French army died of disease. Profitable colony. Prior to the 7 Years' War, the economy of Saint-Domingue gradually expanded, with sugar and, later, coffee becoming important export crops. After the war, which disrupted maritime commerce, the colony underwent rapid expansion. In 1767, it exported 72 million pounds of raw sugar and 51 million pounds of refined sugar, 1 million pounds of indigo, and 2 million pounds of cotton. Saint-Domingue became known as the Pearl of the Antilles, one of the richest colonies in the world in the 18th-century French Empire. It was the greatest jewel in Imperial France's mercantile crown. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue produced about 40% of all the sugar and 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe. This single colony, roughly the size of Hawaii or Belgium, produced more sugar and coffee than all of the British West Indies colonies combined, generating innumerable revenue for the French. That helped them become the most powerful nation on earth at that time. Thousands of slaves were imported from Africa to work on the tobacco, cocoa, cotton and indigo farms. By the mid-18th century, Saint-Domingue had become the most lucrative colony in the Caribbean. Over 40% of all European sugar and 75% of all European coffee, as well as much of France's 18th-century wealth and glory, came from the slave labor in the plantations of La Perle des Antilles. Saint-Domingue Center for Research on Globalization. The labor for these plantations was provided by an estimated 790,000 African slaves, accounting in 1783 to 1791 for a third of the entire Atlantic slave trade. Between 1764 and 1771, the average annual importation of slaves varied between 10,000 and 15,000. By 1786 it was about 28,000, and from 1787 onward, The colony received more than 40,000 slaves a year. However, the inability to maintain slave numbers without constant resupply from Africa meant the slave population in 1789 totaled to 500,000, ruled over by a white population that numbered only 32,000. At all times, a majority of slaves in the colony were African-born. As the brutal conditions of slavery and tropical diseases such as yellow fever prevented the population from experiencing growth through natural increase, African culture thus remained strong among slaves to the end of French rule. The folk religion of Odo commingled Catholic liturgy and ritual with the beliefs and practices of the Vosgian religion of Guinea, Congo and Dahomey. Slave traders scoured the Atlantic coast of Africa, and the slaves who arrived came from hundreds of different tribes, their languages often mutually incomprehensible. The majority came from the Gold Coast and the Slave Coast, followed by Bantus from Congo and Angola. To regularize slavery, in 1685 Louis XIV had enacted the Code Noir, which accorded certain human rights to slaves and responsibilities to the master, who was obliged to feed, clothe and provide for the general well-being of his slaves. The Code Noir sanctioned corporal punishment but had provisions intended to regulate the administration of punishments. In the event, such protections were often ignored by white colonists. A passage from Henry Christopher's personal secretary, who lived more than half his life as a slave, describes the crimes committed against the slaves of Saint-Domingue by the French colonists. Have they not hung up men with heads downward, drowned them in sacks, crucified them on planks, buried them alive, crushed them in mortars? Have they not forced him to consume feces? And, having flayed them with the lash, have they not cast him alive to be devoured by worms, or onto anthills, or lashed them to stakes in the swamp to be devoured by mosquitoes? Have they not thrown them into boiling cauldrons of cane syrup? Have they not put men and women inside barrels studded with spikes and rolled them down mountainsides into the abyss? Have they not consigned these miserable blacks to man-eating dogs until the latter, sated by human flesh, left the mangled victims to be finished off with bayonet and poniard? Thousands of slaves found freedom by fleeing into the mountains, forming communities of Maroons and raiding isolated plantations. The most famous was Cardle, a one-armed slave, originally from Guinea, who escaped in 1751. Ivodo Honguns, he united many of the different Maroon bands. For the next 6 years, he staged successful raids while evading capture by the French. He and his followers reputedly killed more than 6,000 people. He preached a radical vision of destroying white colonization in Saint-Domingue. In 1758, after a failed plot to poison the drinking water of the planters, he was captured and burned alive at the public square in Cap Francais. Saint-Domingue had the largest and wealthiest free population of color in the Caribbean. They were known as the gens de couleur. The royal census of 1789 counted roughly 25,000 such persons. While many free population of color were former slaves, most members of this class were mulattoes, of mixed French, European and African ancestry. Typically, they were the descendants of the enslaved women and French colonists. As in New Orleans, a system of plaquage developed, in which white men had a kind of common-law marriage with slave or free mistresses, and provided for them with a dowry, sometimes freedom, and often education or apprenticeships for their mixed-race children. Some such descendants of planters inherited considerable property. As their numbers grew, they were made subject to discriminatory colonial legislation. Statutes forbade gens de couleur from taking up certain professions, marrying whites, wearing European clothing, carrying swords or firearms in public, or attending social functions where whites were present. The regulations did not restrict their purchase of land, and many accumulated substantial holdings and became slave owners. By 1789, they owned 1/3 of the plantation property and 1/4 of the slaves of Saint-Domingue. Central to the rise of the gens de couleur planter class was the growing importance of coffee. which thrived on the marginal hillside plots to which they were often relegated. The largest concentration of gens de couleur was in the southern peninsula. This was the last region of the colony to be settled, owing to its distance from Atlantic shipping lanes and its formidable terrain, with the highest mountain range in the Caribbean. In the parish of Jérémie, the free population of color formed the majority of the population. Many lived in Port-au-Prince as well, which became an economic center in the south of the island.